Is masculinity toxic? Have men changed over the past century? And if so, why? Today, I'm going to answer all of those questions, as well as expose some dangerous ideologies floating around out there in the ethos related to this topic. And I'm also going to tell you what I think the antidote is. Come with me. Let's walk in truth and live unhindered. There's a new term floating around out there, toxic masculinity. Maybe you've heard it, maybe you haven't, but you need to know about it. You need to understand what it means, where it's come from, and how it's being used, because it very much impacts all of our lives. So let's pick this apart a little bit. What does toxic masculinity even mean? Well, if you go by strict dictionary terms, like I looked up the definition of toxic, I looked up the definition of masculinity, and you put those together, you get the qualities or attributes that are characteristic of men or boys that will cause unpleasant feelings or are harmful or malicious. So in culture, it's a little bit different what they consider the definition to be. I would say in culture, it's widely thought of as being a set of attitudes and ways of behaving that are stereotypically associated and expected of men, and they are regarded as having a negative impact on society as a whole. It's also thought of as the way society's gender based expectations for men can breed unhelpful characteristics and behaviors, including aggression, difficulty expressing emotion, and excessive self reliance. So it's basically the way we are bringing boys up and how that way of bringing them up today is often causing things that they're saying are harmful to our society. The traits that are coming out in them, they're saying are harmful to society. So therefore, it's toxic masculinity. So today I'm going to tell you what I think about this. The APA, the American Psychological Association, that kind of governs how psychologists practice, actually put out a recent article that says that traditional masculinity is harmful. Think about that. Psychologists are now told that traditional masculinity is harmful. They say this is a set of stereotypical ways of behaving for men that are harmful are one, self-reliance. So, the typical not asking for directions, not asking for help, but just like, I can do it attitude. Strength, they're too strong. They're seen as dangerous because they're too strong. Stoicism, which is basically the ability to go through difficult things without showing emotion. So to be somewhere without crying. So to be emotionally strong. Competitiveness. So the fact that they're competitive. Dominance, aggression, their visual stimulation by the female body. So the fact that they like to look at women, and their adverse reactions to feminism. So these are all of the things that are considered to be negative ways of behaving by men that are seen as toxic and affecting our society negatively as a whole. Okay, so how are these things affecting us negatively as a whole? Well, studies show that men are more likely to commit suicide. They're more likely to have ADHD and problems in school. They're more likely to commit violent crime and to be the victims of violent crime. They're more likely to go to prison. They're less likely to see a doctor or a counselor or a psychologist. And I read online that they are more likely to be what is called homophobic. So, in other words, they don't accept homosexuality as a valid lifestyle.
Hey, McFly! What do you think you're doing? Hey, I'm talking to you, McFly, you Irish bug. Hello? Hello? Anybody home? Hey, think, McFly. Think. What are you looking at, butthead?
I guess if we were going to have a definition of toxic masculinity and we needed someone to embody that, Biff would be a perfect example, right? He definitely was toxic, but what about Marty and George McFly? I mean, they were men too, right? Were they not considered masculine? Were they not toxic? I think that Biff was just a bully. I don't think it really has anything to do with him being a man or being masculine. I think he was just a toxic person. But it seems that in culture, this idea of toxic masculinity has been used to villainize men anytime that they behave poorly. Oh, they're just toxic men. It's just toxic masculinity. They're violent, they're misogynist, they're bullies. And it's also been used to point out that men are not as emotional as, or relational as women. So if they're not in touch with their feminine side, we say that they have toxic masculinity. So, how did we get here? How did we get to the point that traditional masculinity in the official literature is seen as toxic? Well, we have to go back a ways, all the way back to the late 1700s, early 1800s, which was the Industrial Revolution. Prior to that, most men worked on a home farm or in a family business that had been handed down for generations. They were very connected to their home, very connected to the family. In fact, I read that most parenting books back in that day were not addressed to mothers. They were written to the fathers because the fathers had such a big role in child rearing, and they were seen as the ones responsible for how their children turned out. Of course, the women back then had their roles. A lot of them were, birthing the babies, taking care of babies, cooking, cleaning, and such. But the fathers were seen as the ones who really needed to be in charge of the child rearing, looking after their children. And then with the Industrial Revolution, we see the distancing of the father from the home and into the workplace. So the term toxic masculinity was actually first coined by a man named Shepard Bliss in the 1980s. And he was using it to describe his very military type authoritarian father. And if you look from that time all the way through about 2015, you see the term then used in some academic texts here and there, but it was not part of our cultural zeitgeist at all. And then beginning in about 2016, if you do a review of the literature and of just news articles and pop culture, you start to see this term popping up everywhere: toxic masculinity, toxic masculinity, toxic masculinity. And it is talked about basically as a sexism that some men have. It's like this flawed character trait that they have. It's been talked about in conversations about Trump, conversations about the Me Too movement, mass shootings, sexual harassment, lots of different situations that occur where toxic masculinity becomes a little buzzword in there. In the book Man Enough, Fathers, Sons, and the Search for Masculinity, which was written in 1993, the author, who is a family therapist, says that a man who had an absent or an uninvolved father is going to be more likely to pursue unrealistic cultural images of masculinity and have to this feeling that he has to keep proving his manhood. And I think that, it's theorized that that's kind of where toxic masculinity is coming from, is those men who had absent and uninvolved fathers. They see what they think a man should be, and they're trying to be that. They're trying to emulate what they see on the outside and prove that they really are a man. Traditionally, toxic masculinity was used to refer to men who were in prison or who were violent, and then it came to be used to refer to men who any poor behavior by any white man, especially a white elite man. So somebody like Trump. So when Trump came on the scene, that's the words narcissism and toxic masculinity became very popular. So that's why we see a huge surge of this in around the time of 2016. And there are certain groups who have really latched onto this idea that white men of privilege are toxic in general. They're using what has been traditionally associated with people who were violent and now applying it to all white privileged men, seen as privileged in the eye of our culture. And as I was doing research for this, I came across a show called Euphoria. And the main character in that show is a white kid, and all of the characters around him seem to be, I didn't watch the show, but I saw like a montage of it. All of the characters around him seem to be either poor or in the LGBTQ community or a different skin color. And in every clip that I saw, he is treating them poorly, being mean to them verbally, actually physically attacking them, all kinds of things going on. He is just, he's even called out in this montage that I saw as being, oh, this privileged white boy who just is trying to keep control. And that's why he's mean to people who are different races, mean to people who have a different, who are in a different community than him, because he wants to keep control as the white man. He wants to keep the patriarchy going. This is the kind of stuff that is being put out there for our kids to watch. And there is a whole change that is going on in the culture that is teaching us to see white man as bad. So we're led to believe that white men with money and good looks are just trying to keep control over the world, and so they want to oppress everyone. And feminists who have been harmed by men are really running with this idea. Those women seem to be angry at all men because of some immoral men who were toxic to them. So some toxic people, they're not necessarily toxic men, they're toxic people. You can't generalize that to all men, but some toxic people have harmed these women, usually sexually. I hear about this often as a counselor, unfortunately. Men who molest children, men who rape women, men who consume porn, they are causing certain women to hate all men. They're giving all men a bad name. But we can't hate all men because of the bad ones. Likewise, we can't hate all women because of the bad ones. And so I'm going to get to that in a minute. This seems to be a double standard. So, how do you describe masculinity? Like, what types of things do you think of when you think of someone who is masculine? Are you thinking violence and bullying and aggression? Are you thinking of Biff when you think of a man? I hope not. I hope that when you think of men, you think of masculinity, you're thinking of honor and leadership and respect and courage and strength and decisiveness and good providers, because that's what I typically think of when I think of masculinity. Genuine masculinity is never bad. Masculinity in and of itself is not a toxic thing. If there's something toxic, it really has nothing to do with masculinity. It's something else. Masculinity isn't meant to harm people. It's meant to protect people. There's a sociologist who did an experiment, and he asked two questions of people all over the world. He asked, what does it mean to be a good man? And all across the world, the young men reported honor, duty, integrity, sacrifice, doing the right thing, looking out for the little guy, protector, provider, responsible. Those were the answers that came back about what does it mean to be a good man. And then the second question was, when someone says man up, what does this mean? And the young men would say that it means to be tough, to be strong, to never show weakness, to win at all costs, to suck it up, be competitive, get rich, get laid. Those are some things, answers that were given. So there's all kinds of ideas about what it means to man up. But overall, it was like, be strong, be tough, don't show weakness, and just get the job done. So if toxic masculinity just means an immoral man, then fine. Masculinity can be toxic at times. I guess I could concede to that. But on the flip side, that means that femininity can also be toxic, right? But we never hear toxic femininity. I was doing a search for it in preparation for making this video, and I found that it does exist out there, although I never hear about it. But when I did a Google search for toxic femininity, I wanted to see if anybody else was raising the question. I came across an article that said toxic femininity is a form of internalized misogyny, which involves restricting yourself to stereotypically feminine behaviors in order to appeal to men. So, toxic femininity just means that the toxic men are making you have to be feminine. So, it just puts the blame right back on the men, apparently. Feminine traits themselves supposedly can't be toxic, but women can be made to be toxic because of these toxic men that are making them have to be toxic. It goes on to point out in that article that some of the toxic feminine traits are being passive, being selfless, being nurturing and compliant, submissive, docile, cooperative, sensitive, polite, empathetic, compassionate, and having home and family oriented values. Most of those things don't sound very toxic to me. But it says that they're only toxic if you're being forced to be those things by a man or by society when you don't really want to be those things. Another article I read said that toxic femininity is the adherence to the gender binary in order to receive conditional value in the patriarchal society. The adherence to gender binary in order to receive conditional value in a patriarchal society. I think that toxic femininity would be getting attention at all costs, flaunting your body, gossiping, over nurturing, codependency, using sex as a weapon, entitlement, seduction, um, emotional manipulation. These are the ways that I see feminine traits being used in a toxic way. I would not say that being compassionate and empathetic and having home and family oriented values is toxic femininity. Those are great. Those are the great things about women. Conservatives see this phrase toxic masculinity as an attack on manhood. There was actually an article I read in The Atlantic that says that progressives think that the detoxification of masculinity is an essential pathway to gender equality. So, if their goal is gender equality, they see that they have to detoxify masculinity in order to get there. Masculinity is keeping them from achieving their goal of gender equality. I think this is a really important point to bring up. So, gender equality, by dictionary terms, is a situation in which access to rights or opportunities is unrestricted by gender. So, it doesn't matter if you're male or female, you should still have the same rights and the same opportunities. However, it doesn't seem as though this is what people truly mean when they say gender equality. Personally, I think that what they're really meaning, these progressives, is gender uniformity. Think about it. They want there to be absolutely no difference between men or women in their skill set and their attributes and pretty much every other category that you can name. They're even trying to tell us that you can just switch from male to female, that there's really no difference except for your outward genitalia. If you switch that, everything's the same because we're really all the same inside, which is a blatant lie. Men and women are not interchangeable, and they cannot be interchangeable in every scenario. Yet they keep pushing this, even though we know that this isn't reality. I think most people, a lot of people, wouldn't have a problem with gender equality. Like, yeah, same rights and opportunities for both genders. Great, no problem. But gender uniformity, trying to pretend that we're all the same, that we can all do the same things, and that we should do the same things, and that there's no difference between us, and we should have all of the same traits, that I am not on board with. And I think that they are using the term gender equality and disguising it as gender uniformity. So some people might say, oh, Kelly, you're just trying to make men act like oppressed victims. You're just encouraging them to be victims. I'm not. I'm just telling them, I'm telling you, if you're a man listening to this, that I just want you to be unapologetically who God created you to be. I don't want you to hate your God given strengths. I don't want you to feel bad or guilty for being a man, for having masculine traits. I want you to fully embrace them because they were given to you by God and they are good. They are so good. Now, can things be used in a toxic way? Absolutely. And we'll get into that. I do think that there is an attempt to villainize men and oppress them, particularly white men. But that doesn't mean that I want them to live as oppressed victims. Go see my first episode. I don't want anybody living as an oppressed victim. I just don't want them to believe lies and hate themselves and feel guilty for being who they are. Check out this video from the BBC.
We use participatory activities such as word association games. These allow the boys to explore the stereotypes that might be in their heads. We'll ask them to talk about the first words that come into their head when they think of a certain topic. For instance, when we're asked to think about men, they may come up with brave, strong, or daring. For women, they may come up with gentle, kind, and caring. So then we ask how and why. What causes these stereotypes? Where do the boys get ideas like, it's weak for men to cry, or men are strong, women are weak? Most of the boys have never had conversations like this before.
The lie that who we are is all nurture rather than nature is crazy. There's a debate, nurture versus nature, how much of it actually determines who we are. But time and time again, we see that it is much more nature than it is nurture. And this idea that we are born clean slates and then we are socialized to either be male or female is a lie. We need to shine light on that. And it is rooted in the theories of a man named Locke. And he came out with the blank slate theory, or the tabula rasa, I think I'm saying that right, theory. He said we're born as blank slates. If somebody likes trucks, it's because their parents told them to. If somebody likes to play with baby dolls, it's because society has told them that that's what they need to do. He didn't believe that there was anything innate, that there was anything built into us. But the truth is that we are born with personalities and talents and temperaments. A lot of who we are is there when we are born. Do things change us? Do things affect us? Do things change how we think about the world and about God and about ourselves as we experience things? Absolutely. But you cannot say that we are born completely blank slates and we have nothing innate within us. That is simply not true. One of the biggest ways to prove this are to look at the identical twins separated at birth scientific studies. I think there's been around 137 sets of identical twins over the years, many, many years, that have been separated at birth and given out, adopted to different families. And then later they reunite, and it is stunning how similar they are, even though nurture was completely different. Masculinity is not the result of being socialized to be masculine. It is not the result of nurture. It is much more the result of nature. Have you ever tried to make a child more masculine or more feminine? Take a tomboy, for example, and try to turn her into more of a girly girl, try to get her to want a pink frilly room. It's probably not going to happen. That's not a very easy thing to do. You can't socialize them out of what they were born with. Now, if you have a tomboy and she goes through puberty, a lot of times that's just going to naturally change as she gets some of those female hormones pumping through her. But for you to try to socialize her as a small child into something different is going to be very difficult. If you ever tried to take a boy who was more feminine and more effeminate and get him to be more masculine and more macho and like sports and want to fight people, it's just not that easy to do. So I think that also proves that we are not just socialized to be this way. We are being who we were born to be. So nurture, or the lack of nurture in some cases, can affect the way a person feels and the way they behave, but it doesn't make them more or less masculine or feminine. Biff was not more masculine than Marty and George. Biff had toxic traits that were manifesting themselves through his masculine strengths and weaknesses. Men were created by God to have certain traits and certain strengths to show that side of the nature of God. We were created in the image of God, male and female. He created them. He took parts of who he is and put them in women. And he took other parts of who he is and he put them in men. And together we come together and we make this perfect image of God. And that is a whole nother video to do of why marriage is between a man and a woman. A marriage makes up the total image of God, and Satan hates that and he wants to destroy that. Our society is trying to make men more emotional, more in touch with their feminine side. Are we really sure that we want that? I mean, could that be dangerous to do that? To strip masculinity away? Because a traditional masculine man, he does things out of a sense of duty, not out of emotion. And if we teach them that there is no manly duty, that they can just act on their emotions, guess what that's going to do? Guess what that has done? It increases violence, mass shootings, things like that. You're going to see more of, if men are acting on their emotions, That's not necessarily a good thing. Why is our society trying to get rid of masculinity? Why is it dangerous for them to do that? And you need to think about these things. What are the dangers of removing the male female binary from uncoupling that beautiful image of God that I talked about? What are the ways that that weakens our marriages, our families, our country? I primarily do marriage counseling, and I can tell you that it is weakening marriages. It is making women so critical of men. They do not appreciate and respect and embrace who God created their husband to be. They are trying to change their husband into something that he isn't. When he expresses himself in a masculine way, they think it's toxic, and it is destroying marriages. It will destroy our country. Because if we don't have strong, brave, honorable men that are willing to go fight for something for our country to defend us, if they are all weak and crying and emotional and in touch with their feminine side, who is going to defend our country? We've got a society where men actually hate their masculinity so much that they're literally trying to turn themselves into women. We have a crisis situation going on here. There are two camps that are trying to use this idea of toxic masculinity to further their very dangerous agendas: the feminists and the LGBTQ community. Both of them have what I think is the same agenda in some ways. They have a desire for the genders or the sexes, whichever you want to refer to them as, to be equal. They both have an agenda to remove the male female binary. Men and women, like I talked about, were created to complement each other as each of them fulfills their own role in God's creation. To do away with those differences and promote gender uniformity with the idea that men and women are not different from each other, to do that in any way undermines the design of God, and it upsets that complementary nature, that complementary role of men and women. And as a result, the unit that is a man and a woman in a marriage, it becomes dysfunctional. And I am seeing this all of the time as I counsel people, because the correct roles are not being fulfilled by the right people. And sometimes there are roles within the home that are just going completely unfulfilled by either partner. This disruption of the order of creation, this disruption of what it means to represent the image of God, this disruption of marriages is satanic. These agendas are satanic. If Satan can upset the very order of things that God has created, surely that is a point for his side, right? After all, the further that someone gets away from their true identity in Christ, then the farther away they're getting from Christ himself. So ultimately, all of this is an attack on God's people. It is an attack on God's design. It is an attack on the way that things are supposed to be. It sows confusion. It disrupts marriages and families. It weakens our nature, or weakens our nation, and it hinders reproduction. We hear a lot of talk about the patriarchy today, and the patriarchy is biblical in the sense that men were created to lead. God appointed a certain order to things, not just humans. He appointed a certain order to everything that he created. If you look around in nature, you will see order, order, and more order. You will see order in the way that everything is done. If take beekeepers, for example, and everything that they learn about bees and how all of that works to produce the honey. You can go intricately into the human body. Every small detail of things that God created represents his sense of order. And that also applies to us as humans. That also applies to how males and females are supposed to interact together. The Bible makes it quite clear that men are to be the leader between the two genders. And I think a lot of women who have never read the Bible or have read very little of it, they take great offense to that. They're like, "Oh, I don't want a man to lead me. I don't need a man to lead me." But you have to realize that if you really understand the Bible and you read more than just a small snippet, God put a very high standard for men. It is not the case of the Bible placing men in a position to abuse or to take advantage of someone. Instead, the Bible appeals for men to become greater and more righteous than they could ever imagine through the power of Christ so that they can lead and provide and protect for their wife and for their families. And that is the proper order of things for our own good. It is set up in a way to protect us as women. It is not something that we should reject. And again, I think that that's happened because there have been so many men that have been abusive. And I hate that. I hate it. I wish that that weren't the case. But we can't take the sin that has been committed against us by ungodly people, or even people that claimed to be godly but weren't, and apply that to all men, and then use it to reject God's very instructions, to reject his very order of things. The order is still good. It's still set in place for a reason. So one of the biggest points I want to make today is that it's not that being born male or being born female makes somebody toxic. You have to understand that women who don't have good feminine role models can be equally as toxic in all the ways that I listed earlier. They can also chase cultural images of femininity. They can see women flaunting themselves on TV and think, oh, that's what I'm supposed to do to be a good woman, to be a real woman, maybe not a good woman, to be a real woman. That's what women do. This is how women get liked. This is how women get attention. So ultimately, the antidote, I think, is that the fathers need to be in the homes. We have an epidemic of fatherlessness in this world. And this lack of good role models, particularly in fathers, but of course also in mothers, is leaving our kids toxic. They're growing up to express themselves in toxic ways that have nothing to do with whether they're masculine or feminine. And it has everything to do with the fact that they are insecure, they are hurt, they are lost, and they don't know who they are. They don't know who they were created to be, and they don't have good role models of how to become that. So the answer is to get the fathers back in the homes. Not just, I'm not talking about, oh, for the Industrial Revolution, they're working out of the home. I'm not saying they have to come back and all the dads have to work at home. Let's start with less divorce. Let's start with less getting people pregnant outside of marriage and then the father not being around for that child's life. Let's have less fathers disappearing and people saying, yeah, I never knew my real dad. I'm tired of people coming to counseling and telling me that they never knew their real dad. Well, no wonder that they're struggling so much. Not only do you need to know your dad, you need to be spending a lot of time with your dad, and your dad needs to be a good man, a good leader, a good role model. So these men, you men out there, you need to be in the homes, you need to be with your children when you're not working, and you need to take charge of the child rearing, of how your kids turn out. You need to be present, and you need to be present in a good way, not alcoholics, not verbally abusive, not toxic in any way. You need to set the stage for who your children are going to become. Because the truth is, yes, the Industrial Revolution was the beginning of it, but you got to think it's about 7 generations at least since then. So generation upon generation upon generation, this is like mutating. It's like it started with how it affected those sons, and then those sons grew up to be fathers, and then they parented in a certain way because of how they were parented, and then they grew up and they parented in a certain way because of how they were parented. And then it's just changed so much. We have more and more fathers not even being a part of their kids being raised. People of a certain generation were raised by men who weren't raised well by men, and so they were raised by fathers who were overcompensating for their masculinity, and they were that military type authoritarian who didn't know how to have a real relationship with their children. Then those boys grew up, and we're to a point now where they're looking back and saying, I don't want to raise my kids that way. So I want to be a more involved and better father. We have a lot who are doing that. I want to give you credit. Not all fathers are absent. There are a lot of fathers who are trying to be better than what their dads were and better than what their granddads were. And they're buying into this toxic masculinity because they're like, oh, that's what my grandpa was. It was toxic masculinity, and I don't want to be that way. So I'm going to go the other way, and I'm going to deny my masculinity, and I'm going to be more feminine. And that's not going to be good for your sons either. We're seeing that that has not been good for sons. And then we have, starting around the 70s and 80s, we had a lot of mothers outside of the home working too. And so we're at a point where people are not even being raised at all. There are no parents in many homes. The fatherlessness alone, single parent homes between 1970 and 2021 went from 7.6% of homes having a single parent, usually the mother, to 17% of homes having a single parent, usually the mother. We have changed drastically in just a 50-year period. The research is very clear. It shows that boys, in particular, who were raised without a father in the home, this is what the research shows. They are more likely to have emotional problems, depression, anxiety, low self esteem, social withdrawal. They may have a lot of emotional pain, anger, sadness. They feel worthless. I cannot tell you how many men I see in my counseling office with depression, anxiety, low self esteem, social anxiety. And they say, yeah, I never knew my dad, or yeah, my dad wasn't really around, or maybe their dad was toxic in some way. Also, boys without a father in the home are more likely to have behavioral problems. They're more likely to lash out, to be violent. They may have difficulty forming strong social bonds, or they're also more likely to have academic problems. So they're going to struggle in school. They're going to have ADHD. They're more likely to use abuse substances, more likely to get hooked on drugs and alcohol. They're more likely to be arrested, more likely to have a criminal activity, resent authority figures, and have a heightened sense of anger. All of those things I just talked about are what the research shows happens with boys often. Of course, there are always exceptions to the rule. Often happens with boys raised in fatherless homes. They have much higher rates of all of those things. And if you think about it, those are all of the same things I read earlier from the American Psychological Association of what they characterize as toxic masculine traits. So if you match it up, here's what toxic masculine traits are. Here's what causes them. Boys being raised in fatherless homes. They match. So this toxic masculinity is not because they were born male. It's not because their God-given strengths and weaknesses are wrong and they need to become feminine. It's because they didn't have a daddy. A moral and godly man is a great asset to his family, to his society, to his marriage, to his nation. I love a quote that I read by Jordan Peterson, and it says, "A harmless man is not a good man. A good man is a very, very dangerous man who has it under control."